The assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife in the summer of 1914 and the Great War that followed would do much more than simply knock the Austrian and German nobility off their thrones, but the general understanding of the spiritual order of the world would be upended, since nobility were supposed to have been divinely created and appointed by God and watched over by his angels. Americans in the New World had learned self-reliance, being so far away from Europe, and in America the New Landers were reading Emerson's book about the natural man in 1836 and studying the science of nature that was all the rage, because it was opposed to the notion that God had chosen to elevate kings and queens over the common natural man, and in the New World in America the importance of the individual was being trumpeted over the status of the nobility. Theories of quote-unquote humanism, with its belief in a common noble nature, was opposed to there being a divinely decreed class of nobles by birth, and humanists said that punishment was not necessary and that materialism was for the common good, and that people had utilitarian usefulness and were deserving of equality and justice. The humanists created the concept of quote-unquote public opinion, with newspaper writers and journalists acting as their guides, who were working out of a duty to the common man rather than for any personal gain, and Adam Smith wrote books about free trade and free play of natural laws, and he wrote about the science of peaceful production before Marx ever started putting words on paper. Sir Walter Scott wrote stories about brave heroes adventuring into the untamed wilderness, and Thomas Jefferson had wanted Lewis and Clark to give copies of Defoe's Robinson Crusoe to the American Indians, who were being described romantically as the noble savage. And many books were written in England along these lines, describing nature in America as idyllic and peaceful. The English had long experience dealing with aboriginals in foreign lands, but the Indians they ruled were mostly in tropical climates, and American Indians did not buckle down like these others, and when some Indians in America were invited over to visit the British Queen, the English found out that the American noble savage was a cannibal and a slaver, and a torturer just like the rest. The diverse nature of the many Indian tribes in North America presented remarkable challenges for explorers, and there was confusion in England over the word Indian because the English could not believe that atrocities had been committed by their beloved and peaceful India Indians, their colony of choice, and in America all the Indians had liked Lewis and Clark along what is now U.S. Highway 12, running beside the Clearwater River in Idaho. When Lewis and Clark saw starvation and warfare among the Indians, their foremost promise had been to help them become civilized and equal Americans. The French who'd fled the terror wanted to be as far away from their old way of life as possible, so they migrated into the woods and built canoes and put as much distance between them and civilization as was humanly possible. And Indians in America had gotten to know many French, not just the traders and the trappers, but also the French Catholics who sent missionaries among them, and there, with the bear and the deer and the beaver, they could forget the horror of revolutionary France. The British had allowed the fleeing French aristocracy into Canada because they had nowhere else to go, and also because their substantial grudge against the French revolutionaries could be used by the British against Napoleon's revolutionaries, who were embracing the guillotine back home. Unfortunately, France had sent guns over to Canada to give to Indians to fight the British, and in that warfare half the Indians sided with the British, especially the Mohawks, and this sort of thing had been going on before and throughout the French and Indian Wars. When the Europeans had arrived, there were probably no more than 1 million native Indians in America, and it had taken 15 years for the Indians to start attacking settlers, and that had caused King George to send troops over to America to protect the colonists, but more definitively to protect the Indians from the French. Learning some French language and making friends with Frenchmen doomed the Indians in America, because the U.S. became friendly again with the British after the terror in France of 1789, and that left mostly Southerners willing to be friendly with the French. The land around St. Louis had first been claimed for France by a Frenchman named La Salle in 1682, who named it after his King Louis. And before him, a French priest and a trapper had made friends with the Indians around St. Louis in 1673, and after them, French priests built a mission in St. Louis in 1700, and then miners showed up to dig lead out of the ground to make bullets. Some Spanish had been living up the Mississippi since 1541, but a French trapper built the first trading post in 1763 at St. Louis, and the French government had let only Catholics come over to America, so France didn't get as many American settlers as they might have. Spain claimed Missouri in 1762, and France took it back in 1800, until the U.S. bought Missouri from France 3 years later, in 1803, and Lewis and Clark were sent out to explore the new land that now belonged to America, after which Lewis was made the governor of Missouri. The Lewis and Clark expedition was undertaken not as a conquest for empire, but for the advancement of science with expansion into the Wild West. And the journey was also used as military training for young officers, and it was considered to be a scientific survey rather than a police action. Earthquakes along the New Madrid Fault shook everyone up when Missouri became a territory in 1812, and the earthquakes were felt 1,000 miles away. And Missouri mostly wanted to be a slave state, while the man spearheading the Missouri Compromise in 1820 said, "I would rather be right than be president." There were 11 free states in the North and 11 with slavery in the South, so Missouri had become the crucial battleground in having a balance between slave and free. And the slave trade was made punishable by death in 1820, and people were supposed to have only the slaves they owned as breeding stock, and they were not supposed to buy any more. But juries in the South would not uphold the law, and Missouri became a slave state in 1821 because Maine was admitted free, and that kept the score 12-12. The Californians were not interested in the debate over slavery, but they certainly wanted a railroad, and going west included the search for finding the best route for running a railroad so the United States could link up with the Pacific Ocean and thereby realize a shorter trade route to China. The West had once been considered the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, but after 1840 the real West opened up that would bring the American dream to life. People wanted to get away from civilization and were enchanted with the Wild West. And from 1790 to 1840, the population of America grew fourfold after having rid themselves of King George's redcoats, and the American army was now tasked with bringing law and order to Indian country, and some pioneers went west seeking religious freedom, especially the Mormon Church that had been born in 1830. Joseph Smith would be murdered by a mob in St. Louis in 1844, and other religious Americans had disliked Joseph Smith because he talked too much about magic crystals and myths from German fairy tales. It wasn't simply people hoping for a better life that were moving west, though there were many of those, but thousands of rich folks went west looking for adventure, and the rich were good at getting into trouble, and because most of them had friends in Congress back home, the U.S. began building forts to keep the well-to-do people safe from Indians. Congress had passed a law in 1820 that any American could buy a farm from the government for $100 instead of the old price, selling a whole section for $640, and this made the factory owners in New England mad because many of their workers quit their jobs to head out west, And the new farm law made the South mad because the government was spending Southern taxes on Western roads. The South wanted each state to pay for their own roads, but the Great Wild West was divided only into territories that had not yet gained statehood, and as Americans moving west were in need of military protection, which was quite expensive, more tax money had to be raised to pay for soldiers to fight the hostile Indians. While the Navy had been consuming its fair share of the budget, Jefferson had created the Army Corps of Engineering and the Academy at West Point to train officers who could lead civilian militias, and he did not intend for the military to be kept separate from civilians because Jefferson had seen the British Army use professional soldiers, and that had not worked out well for them. The only place in America where Indians didn't fight the Europeans was at Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, and at the mouth of the Duwamish River, the Duwamish Indians had spent most of their time hiding out in Olympia from their hostile Indian neighbors up north, who were both slavers and cannibals. The Pacific Northwest was the very last portion of the earth to be mapped, apart from the inland jungles of the Amazon and the San Juan Mountains of Colorado and the interior of Africa that was called the Heart of Darkness, and nobody had made a map of the Pacific Northwest because sailing ships were powered by trade winds that were created by the spinning of the earth, and the wind carried them clockwise in the northern Pacific, so sailing north from California towards the Pacific Northwest meant going against the wind. Ships could sail from Russia to reach America and then follow the trade winds south towards the Pacific Northwest, but they would usually run out of food or be murdered by hostile Indians well before reaching the Columbia River. The whole world was looking for a shorter route to China, and it seemed that going over the top of the globe would be the best bet, and while some imagined that the sea above North America could be free of ice, they would find out the hard way that they were sadly mistaken. By 1800, the British knew how to avoid scurvy by eating limes, which gave them the nickname Limeys, and went a long way towards making them the undisputed ruler of the seas. The Spanish had learned about the Pacific Ocean by walking over Panama, and had sailed north to Alaska where they planted the Spanish flag before heading down to California. And the Spanish had sailed into Monterey Bay and built a prison, a presidio, with the intention of protecting their silver mines in New Mexico. Some Spaniards from Mexico had gone north, overland from Santa Fe, but when they reached the Utah desert, winter had arrived, and they turned back towards Santa Fe, and they were haunted by the promises they'd made to the Indians that they would return to build a mission, but they never did. There were 25 million Indians in Mexico in 1500, and after less than 100 years there would be less than 1 million of them, and after the Spanish learned not to trust them, the Mexican Indians would resort to capturing Spaniards and cutting out their hearts while the Spanish were still alive. And while the Aztecs and the Mayans didn't actually fight back in the ordinary sense, their weapon of choice was poisoned food, and most of the natives were cannibals. The Spaniards weren't interested in gold for themselves, but were seeking gold they could bring to their Spanish king and queen, who wanted gold primarily to give as a gift to their beloved Pope in the Vatican in Rome. Spain held back on warring with England because they didn't want England so weak that they couldn't beat France, since the French could quickly take over all of Europe without the English to contain them, and Spain helped the Americans to some degree against King George, even though the Declaration of Independence gave them a fair amount of worry. During the War of American Independence, Spain helped the Americans by letting them park ships in Spanish harbors, because an independent U.S. might be able to weaken England to the point where they would be vulnerable enough that Spain might be able to make England Catholic again. Russia had owned all the land in the Pacific Northwest down to the Presidio in San Francisco, and the Tsar had sent the Russian fleet to both San Francisco and New York Harbor to help his friend Abraham Lincoln so the British and the French couldn't interfere in the war between the states. And after the war, the Tsar would sell Alaska to the victorious North because he trusted Lincoln to keep the British out of the Pacific Northwest, where they were certain to be a threat to Russia. Spain had pulled out of Oregon in 1819, after which the British shared it with the Russians, until 1824 when the Russians went back home. The Mexican government couldn't keep order in their California territory and were unable to stop Indian raids. So the Mexican officials were giving land to anyone willing to build any measure of civilization, and by 1840 many missionaries had made inroads into Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, but only a few hundred of them had survived. The good thing about the way west was that survival depended on erasing petty distinctions between class, gender, race, or religion. So the Wild West had been America's true melting pot, and giving alcohol to the Indians was supposed to be against the law, but it worked like a charm. When Hudson had first sailed into the bay, he came upon some Indians who were busy fishing, and he'd offered them some brandy, and the name Manhattan was a later version of the Indian word that meant the island where we all got drunk. Indian massacres were usually brought about by arguments over alcohol, and the American settlers would fight with drunken Indians until yellow fever or smallpox or measles had killed enough of them to make selling alcohol to Indians no longer a social problem. The British had tried to keep alcohol away from the Indians, treating it like a medicine, and they tried to be authoritative rather than merely exploiting the natives, while the French lived with the Indians along the Missouri River and married their women and ate their food, and any problems with alcohol was shared with the French and the Indians equally. The British had quality blankets and knives to trade from their Hudson's Bay Company based in Montreal, Canada, while the Americans had mostly alcohol for sale, and the Indians were drinking so much by 1820 that there was a fur shortage that year, and non-Indians had to step in to keep the fur trade going. Tricorner hats and top hats and a variety of other hats were made out of beaver skins, and beaver flourished in the clear streams of the headwaters of the Missouri River, and furs bought from the Indians were sold to England and to China, and in its heyday 80,000 beaver pelts were taken out of the Snake River ecosystem every year. The annual meeting of the fur traders was called a rendezvous because of the trappers' French origins, and the entire fur-producing region from the mouth of the Mississippi to the watershed of the St. Lawrence River had been called New France, until the British alliance with Prussia in the 7 Years' War lost the French their foothold in America. Individual Frenchmen stayed, because there were not enough authorities present to tell anyone to leave, and the city of St. Louis was built right where the Missouri River met the mighty Mississippi on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. And as the beaver and the otters were trapped out, the fur traders headed ever further west to find more, making friends with the myriad of Indian tribes as they went. Until recently, most people had known that North Country only vaguely as a remote wilderness, a land that produced only furs and lumber, where fruit would not grow and grain would not ripen, a chill land of ice and snow and interminable winters, where the temperature was often too low for the thermometer to record it. But now letters and newspapers from the territory had begun to tell a different tale of a beautiful country with lakes and rivers thick with fish, forests full of game, and fertile acres on which farms would flourish. Always these reports praised the Minnesota climate. It was without an equal in healthfulness. A land without chills and fever was what Dr. Mayo, too, was looking for, and nearby was a beauty spot all visitors to the territory rode out to see, Minnehaha Falls, the girlhood home of Laughing Water, the gentle wife of Hiawatha. The Doctor's Mayo by Helen Clapsaddle, New York, Pocketbooks, Simon & Schuster, University of Minnesota edition, published December 1941, 1956, 1970, page 14 through 15. Dr. Mayo traveled around by canoe, quote, shooting down rapids and again gliding leisurely along past tall pine trees, or watching the bright eyes of the deer as they paused for a moment. And he slept in the canoe, swung to sleep by the light, rippling waves, while the boat was tied to the banks, waiting for the morning's light. Mayo, page 17. John Jacob Astor used Mackinac Island as a base for his American Fur Company because it was right in the middle of the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan, and all the traders had to pass by there, and Astor's American Fur Company became the first monopoly in America. Astor's company sold alcohol to the Indians at Mackinac Island for 50 cents a bottle that cost 5 cents a gallon to make, and they charged the same prices to Europeans, and alcohol sales brought more profits to Astor than selling beaver pelts. All the mountain men were dying in debt to the fur companies, because they would wake up after the big yearly rendezvous and find themselves hungover and broken. Astor donated money to the temperance societies after years of this sort of thing. Astor built a farm in New York that went from Times Square to the Hudson River, and society people thought he was rude, but when he died, John Jacob Astor was the richest man in America. The British started making hats out of silk from China in 1832, and the price of beaver fell, and the last big fur traders' meeting was held in 1840, and while only missionaries had ventured west to bring Christianity to the Indians before then, or mail to the fur trappers, after 1840, a few hundred brave Americans began moving to Oregon to settle in the Promised Land. The first religious service in Idaho was financed by businessmen suffering from the scourge of alcoholism, and the church service was held at Fort Hall in 1834, and the U.S. Independent Treasury was born in 1841 when Uncle Sam found out that ranch owners back in England were financing sheep farmers who were encroaching on cattle country, and the war between the farmer and the cowman was going on in Montana and Wyoming, with cattle barons working for their masters back in England, using barbed wire fences at the expense of American farmers, and so limits were put on the amount of grazing land one could fence, but that only escalated the conflict between the British interests and the Americans. Britain was using silver as currency, and America had to grow up and get its financial house in order, so America went on the gold standard instead in 1848, and that fired up the gold rush as the gold in California became real money. Gold fever hit hard in San Francisco, and there were so many sailors abandoning their ships for the gold fields that they had to drag the empty ships out of the water to make parking places for more arriving every day. The abandoned ships were taken apart so the lumber could be used for new buildings, and Telegraph Hill was whittled away to make ballast for the ships returning to Seattle to pick up more lumber to build more gold mining camps in California. The ballast was used in Seattle to fill for that expanding city, where the mudflats were built up to create land for new residents, and the soft soil under Pioneer Square was less likely to withstand earthquakes, and it only took a few years to collect all the surface gold in California, while the rest had to be laboriously squeezed out of the ground. The mines in the mountains around Victor, Colorado, would yield more gold than California and Alaska combined, but the Rocky Mountain gold was bound up in an ore called gold telluride that needed to be heated to extreme temperatures to extract the gold, while in California and Alaska, the gold was in the form of pure flakes and visible nuggets that could be simply washed out of the dirt, so the easier method attracted the majority of miners with the easy pickings along the west coast, rather than the difficult mining and challenging weather of the Colorado mountains. Before the gold rush, settlers had been moving steadily west by building rough log cabins and living in them until somebody else moved in close enough to see their smoke, and then it was time to move on. Moving west was not cheap, and not everyone could manage it, and lots of people took tools and seeds and animals with them when they went west because there was no way to make any money or find employment when they got there, and the pioneer lifestyle remained quite different from that of people living in the industrial cities back east.